Acquisition of magic user spells. Inform those players who have opted for the magic user profession that they have just completed a course of apprenticeship with a master who was of unthinkably high level, at least sixth, having been a relatively apt pupil, worked diligently, and made every effort to please, master or mistress as the case may be, was kind enough to prepare a special present for the character before he or she goes out into the world to seek his or her fortune. At this juncture, request the player to ready a piece of paper which will go into his or her records as a permanent fixture. Instruct the player to entitle the page First Level Spells Known. And we are here today reading D&D aloud with me, uh, author, historian, writer, podcaster, father, and playing card enthusiast Ben Riggs. And with me is the one, the only, the master, the myth, the legend, the wizard of Wauwatosa, Dr. Scott Bruner.
Good morning, everyone.
Uh, and I feel like we have to immediately launch into discussing this paragraph because considering it's titled Acquisition of Magic User Spells, which is an incredibly dry title, this is one of the better paragraphs of writing I have seen in the DMG so far.
What do you mean by better piece of writing?
Um, Considering that this is technical writing, and the most important thing in this is that Gygax get across the idea of how to play D&D. Um, he doesn't just say, uh, "You start with first level spells," which he could have done. He could have just said, "You start with first level spells." Instead, he gives us this story about your character. And he tells you that, yeah, you just finished an apprenticeship and you were really, really good. This is Steve Winter, who was one of the lead hands on second edition, described first edition as Uncle Gary talking to you over your shoulder, explaining to you how to play a game. And this is the one of the strongest pieces of that Uncle Gary voice I have heard so far. Like you could see him taking this directly out of a session of AD&D first edition.
Yeah, as a writing teacher, the sentence at this juncture request the player to ready a piece of paper which will go into his or her records as a permanent fixture drives me nuts. Because the concept is that you're telling the piece of paper, get ready, you're about to have spells. I'm sorry, it's just it's funny to me because he's talking to the piece of paper.
It's
Um,
certainly not the
but right.
most it's not perfect, but compared to some of the dry pieces that we have read of Gygax's writing, this to me seems very vivid.
Yeah, no, I know I'm being a bit pedantic because that's what I do as a writing instructor. Again, like what could this is such a great question for the Discord. Is there any role-playing game out there in 2024 that is full of I don't know what word we could possibly use, but seems well, you just put it. It's like Uncle Gary is standing over your shoulder. Is there even any role play? Like we have so moved towards accessibility and making sure that, not only accessibility, but like technicality isn't exactly the word, but like we are so is there a role-playing game that has such a funny concept of somebody telling you, not just specifically, but literally telling you specifically how you're going to lay out the piece of paper that you're going to write your spells on. It's wonderful. Um, it's also hilarious.
To me, this echoes uh the Deadlands RPG core books from the 90s.
Yeah.
If you're unfamiliar with Deadlands, it is the Weird West role-playing game from Pinnacle Entertainment. I think they're still Pinnacle Entertainment. Um, and it's fantastic. Savage Worlds came out of that RPG, but the core books were largely written, I believe the word is diegetically in world, like when the world was
Yeah.
being described to you, It wasn't like I am a game designer describing to you the world of the Weird West. It was, hey, partner, welcome to the Weird West. I see you
Yeah.
just got off the train. Um, and it was a very absorbing way of consuming a world and very enjoyable.
Yeah,
Like those
yeah.
books you could really read for fun. And this isn't exactly the same thing, but it reminds me of that. Go ahead, Scott. Sorry.
Well, I'm thinking about like why we like those things. As soon as you mention that, I can't stop but think about the Baldur's Gate rule books, the original ones, like Baldur's. I'm specifically, well, I actually think Baldur's Gate 1 did it as well. But how you would have comments in the margins from Elminster and Volo, making comments around the rules, and it made it seem as if you were like, as if you had. I mean, it made no sense because, of course, if you were living in the Forgotten Realms, nobody owned a 1998 IBM PC. At the same time, there was like this kind of weird idea that you had like picked up this forbidden piece of of lore off of the streets, and were like, wow, look at these people are actually commenting on what's going on. It made you feel like you were reading something that, as you mentioned, like with the Deadlands RPG, which I'm not familiar with, was actually like a piece of what was an artifact from the world itself. And it's interesting because now I'm thinking around like, because this is explicitly not a an artifact from the world of Greyhawk or Forgotten Realms at all, and yet it does feel like we've picked up a spell book of a spell book of somebody who created Greyhawk, as if you're actually reading the text of somebody who had jotted down their notes on what it was like to decide what the deities were, where the land masses were, or how a wizard in this world needs to make sure that they're titling their spell list.
Yeah, I guess you would call this
But
Gygax's DM voice, Gygax's DM voice, right?
yeah,
And I
right.
don't know that we've really heard, like we've heard a lot of Gygax designer. I don't know that we've heard a lot of Gygax dungeon master before in this. We're on page 39. Um,
Yeah.
we've made more progress in the past 6 weeks, I think, than we did in the prior 6 months. So go team. But sorry, Scott, I think you were going to say something.
No, I don't know. It's just it's just so wonderfully amazing, like this entire book. And I know people are probably tired of me saying how much I love this, but you just don't get this anymore. You know, you don't get this concept of, as you put it, like Uncle Gary looking over your shoulder. It's if we did a study of this from, I mean, we're doing this from the perspective of like, let's take this seriously. Let's take a look at like each of the rules, what are the mechanics, what was Gary Gygax thinking as he wrote these things. But it's amazing to think of, I know we're going to have the one of the things in my head currently is, Irving Goffman, the sociologist, anthropologist. Oh, I just mixed those two up, and now my dissertation committee is somewhere being upset. I'm talking about frame analysis, this concept of how you move. Do I have to explain this now?
Yes, you have to
That
explain frame analysis.
so the concept of, and what it's so unbelievably applicable to Dungeons and Dragons. And the reason I'm thinking about it is because we're going to have Dr. Laycock on the show shortly, and he talks quite a bit around this concept that when we have conversations with people, we move in and out of different frames, right? And tabletop role-playing games are a wonderful way to think about frames. That if you have a conversation during a tabletop role-playing game, and I say something along, oh, yeah, I'm totally going to, because this section is in his book, and I just read it yesterday. He talks about so. Again, Dr. Laycock, the person who wrote Dangerous Games about the satanic panic around Dungeons and Dragons, has a section where he talks about if somebody at a table says, um, and I'm literally using the example that he uses. The dungeon master says something along the lines of, "How do you deal with this?" And he's like, "Well, I want to roll a charisma check, pass the chips. I rolled an 18." And the concept is, in that sentence, you have gone through a number of different frames, meaning that you have gone through, you're performing multiple roles. And people actually, and just me saying that sentence, everyone listening to this podcast understood what each of those roles were, right? Pass the chips means the player is asking for you to give me over the Starfield branded Doritos. That's one frame. I roll a charisma check means the player that I'm sitting in front of is rolling a check. And then you could say
Do
Grok
you,
the Barbarian says,
do you recall what chapter it's in?
no, I don't. It's
Okay.
one of I want to say one of the first couple of
Okay,
chapters.
I'll keep looking and see if I can
Yep.
find the passage.
But the point is that we move through different frames, is that we are often playing different performances. And it's amazing to think about how we are all able to deftly and on the fly constantly know what frame somebody is referring to. For instance, if as we're recording this podcast, if I suddenly step back and say, "Ooh, sorry, I just burped there for a second," we understand that that is not meant for the audience listening to the podcast. Now, the reason I'm bringing up frame analysis is how often Gygax is moving through different frames, through the frame of this is a real world. Here's what we're talking about in regards to their verisimilitude of the world that we're creating together. Here is Gygax talking to you as a dungeon master and saying you've got to make sure that your player's title, and not only title, but you need to use all caps when you write first level spells known. Um, and I don't think there's as many frames in a modern tabletop role-playing game textbook. It's all written from a fairly generic, um, what's the word I'm looking for? It doesn't have that personal voice that comes in and out of these different frames, that comes out of different. It doesn't feel as human as the Advanced Dungeon Master's Guide, for lack of a better word.
I think I found the paragraph. You mind if I read it aloud?
Please.
All right. So Joseph P. Laycock wrote this, Dangerous Games. The subtitle is What the Moral Panic Over Role-Playing Games Says About Play, Religion, and Imagined Worlds. The book is spectacular. Um, if you think to yourself, well, I lived through that. I don't need to read a book about it. The reason that I would suggest you do need to read a book about it is because of the amazing amount of research that Laycock put into this. To cite one example, as I'm flipping through this, he mentions that he read a book called A Christian Response to Dungeons and Dragons. Like that is how deep he got into research on this. That he actually went and read the book, A Christian Response to Dungeons and Dragons, and writes about it in here. And that level of research is incredibly valuable to people who are interested in history and D&D. Also, he's a good writer, so I recommend it. But here's the, I believe, the paragraph Scott is referencing. Sorry to read this so awkwardly. Second, Fine employs a sociological theory known as frame analysis. Outsiders are sometimes disturbed that gamers become absorbed in a world that is not real. The human ability to experience alternate quote worlds unquote and alternate definitions of reality was first studied by William James and then by Alfred Schutz. I think it's Schutz, Schutz. These thinkers describe how human beings can direct their attention toward different worlds of meaning and that these worlds are quote real unquote as long as we attend to them. I want to read that sentence again because that is a really good sentence. These thinkers describe how human beings can direct their attention toward different worlds of meaning, and that these worlds are, quote, real, unquote, so long as we attend to them, which kind of answers my question of why does the One Ring role playing game feel like Middle Earth when I play the One Ring role playing game? Continuing with Laycock, madness, of course, is a classic example of a private subjective world. But
Right?
art, science, and religion also present distinct worlds to experience. All of these discrete worlds exist alongside the world of practical realities, or what Schutz calls, quote, the world of daily life, end quote. Gregory Batson further develops this theory in an essay entitled, quote, A Theory of Play and Fantasy, end quote, that analyzes such activities as play and ritual. Batson notes that play and ritual are unique contexts of communication wherein the ordinary meaning of signs is changed. For instance, a clenched fist is a sign of aggression. However, if the clenched fist is, quote, only play, end quote, it can mean something else entirely. Batson coins the term frame to describe these contexts of metacommunication in which signs do not carry their ordinary meanings. Irving Goffman develops Batson's model into an entire theory of social organization called frame analysis. And on we go. And the next paragraph is quite long and contains the example Scott was talking about. But I figured since we're talking about, so Joseph Laycock will be on in a few weeks. I would imagine you'll hear an episode from him by probably a month from now. Well, I should say mid-May because I don't know when you're hearing this. Mid-May, hopefully you'll be hearing from Joseph Laycock. Um, but again, his book is spectacular. And I see your connection here, Scott, where like Gygax stepping into his dungeon master voice is stepping out into a new frame. I think of it as a new voice because I'm a
Well,
writer, but you're right, that the frame seems to work too.
yeah, I am. I mean, I'm sitting here. I mean, we're working through this in real time, and I had no idea I was going to be thinking about this at all. But I'm just so struck by this concept of like, it's amazing how, I was running my kids are downstairs, and they're going through the fifth edition players handbook, and they were making characters yesterday and making their own dungeons. It's really fun and of course I'm sitting there with it like, and it's so what is the word I want to use? It's fifth edition. All of the books so from the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide are so written, so well written. They're so accessible, but they don't have this level. And it is funny because I know, Dr. Laycock is obviously coming from it from the angle of like this concept of the satanic panic, and it comes back to what you were talking about is like, why does this book like I don't think you could pick up. Here's a claim I'm going to make, and somebody can can take issue with this. I don't think you could pick up the fifth edition Player's Handbook and think that it is a potential necron. Oh, can I get through that
How
word?
about
Nec
Grimoire?
necro. Thank you.
You're
I,
welcome.
I sound like Porky, like Porky Pig, right?
Necronomicon, Grimoire.
Necronomicon of like forbidden lore because it does read like it reads it's not that different than a manual for how to change the oil in your car. No, it's extremely well done. It's really good at telling you how to change the oil in your car. At the same time, reading the AD&D guides, I said a few minutes ago, it's so unbelievably human, but it does read like the fact that the voice in this book does feel like a dark wizard telling you exactly like I can see a Patricia Pulling reading this and reading this concept of like, look, it's specifically telling you what to write on the page. That is how you're going to get children to manifest spells in their rooms, right? It has an eldritch nature to it.
Yeah, and just to cite the reference, Patricia Pulling's son committed suicide. She blamed D&D, and she wrote a book called "Who is Stalking Your Children for Satan" or
Yeah,
something like that.
yeah, yeah.
And she started a organization called Bad Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons. Um, and she was a very active moral panicker. She is a sadder one, I would say, because you're like, oh man, your kid
Oh
killed
yeah.
himself, and it's so sad. At the same time, I feel as though the story of Patricia Pulling is one of uh warning about the human condition, where to make our lives make sense, we will believe almost anything. And it was easier for her to believe my kid killed himself because of this thing that entered our lives,
Right.
that came in from outside and destroyed his life and my life, than to say what was going on inside him or inside our lives that drove him to kill himself.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
it's interesting to me. Like when I use that reference, quickly, like it's interesting to you. It's like one of those sadder things. Like I don't. It's easy to make light, and again, this is I suppose this is just a great prelude to having Dr. Laycock on. But I mean, I've always been fascinated by that. Like I don't use that to make fun at all. And as a matter of fact, I'm using it to say, to in some ways justify that this book, The Advanced Dungeon Master's Guide, is full of this concept of this idea of an aged um I said eldritch a few minutes ago, this concept of like a wizard who really does know how to cast spells. And of those of us who are, well, it's the same thing as like, it was so difficult to know how to play Dungeons and Dragons unless you had a 13-year-old who was willing to teach you when you were 10 years old. That this book is so written in this format of it does feel like it resonates with a kind of strange power. And my point is that I'm actually sympathetic. I'm not sympathetic at all to this concept that we've had for hundreds of years. This concept that media is going to completely warp someone's viewpoint. But at the same time, if there's so many examples that we can pull from this book that resonate with this concept that this book has a power, or that this world or this game or this media has a unique and singular capacity for creating worlds that somebody who is not being instructed on how to play the game from their 13-year-old teenage brother can really, you could, you mentioned it a few minutes ago. There's a weird verisimilitude about the power of this book that I think people pulling passages out randomly or out of context, or with out of the in the wrong frame, so to speak. Thank you, Irving Goffman.
Huh.
If you use the wrong frame to look at this book, you're going. There's plenty of passages or examples or moments that you can say, "My gosh, this is a book of how to cast spells."
Wow. I did not think that we were gonna this paragraph was gonna lead us to a uh rhetorical or a theoretical defense of the moral panickers. Um,
Well,
that's like, so you're saying the problem is one of
they
the
were
roots of the
right.
moral one of the roots of the moral panic was that they were using the wrong frame to read the book. Therefore, like they were reading it like it was a religious text, not a game manual. Therefore, they took it they took it seriously and not
Well,
playfully. Therefore, we got the satanic panic. That's what you're saying, right?
that's exactly what I'm saying, and that was a really, really fantastic way to break it down. And now I'm just completely I'm completely floored. Is again, there's another frame. There's a metaphor, right? I'm completely struck by this concept that frames are so important to our understanding of this. Is that how many, like the same reason that you and I find this text so unbelievably compelling, the same reason that the 11-year-old version of myself found it so compelling, is exactly the same reason that Patricia Pulling or the other folks that were around the Satanic Panic in the 1980s is because it feels so real. Like we've talked so many times from the cover, from the way that Guy Gax is talking to us, from the fact that this felt like a new game, it felt like a new genre, it felt like a new practice that we were performing. It felt like it felt like a forbidden practice that was so new and so unbelievably compelling, is exactly the same reason that people were upset by it. Because not only was it a new practice, not only is it something that people couldn't identify when they saw kids sitting around a table rolling multi-sided dice and talking about magic missile. What we found so wonderfully fantastic about it at 11 and 13 is exactly what parents found so terrifying at 48.
I will briefly throw out, I think it's Joseph Campbell.
Sure.
Joseph Campbell, someone I loved in my 20s and I came back to again in my 40s, and I thought to myself, what a moron.
Oh,
Which
no.
like so I read so much Joseph Campbell between the ages of 18 and 25, and I want to say about 5 years ago I tried again, and knowing what I know now, I'm like, Joseph, what were you doing? uh Fundamentally. uh anyway, his
Pun,
quote in
pun
this,
intended.
yeah, his the I think this is a Joseph Campbell quote, or at least idea. I believe he said something like, poets and prophets have the same voice in their head. It's just that prophets attribute the voice in their head to an outside source, whereas poets realize that the voice is inside them and is the subconscious, genius, whatever you want to call it. But because poets accurately place that voice within themselves, they do not write for God, but because prophets, shamans, etc., think the voice is coming from somewhere else, they go and create religions. Uh, and if that's not Joseph Campbell, I apologize. And if you're wondering why I thought that Joseph Campbell was a real moron when I got to my 40s, A, I just knew a lot more. Like, the first time I read Joseph Campbell, I hadn't lived in Egypt for 2 years and learned Arabic. But going back in my 40s and rereading Joseph Campbell after having lived in Egypt for 2 years and learning Arabic, a lot of the stuff he says is very surface level. Secondly, I'd never watched The Power of Myth, his interviews with Bill Moyers from, I think, the early 1980s. And Joseph Campbell starts off with essentially a defense of war and the glory of dying in war, which was very weird. I'm like spoken like someone who sat out World War II as a professor and also wrote some nice things about the Nazis early on. Then he shut up about that like a smart person. So I'm willing to forgive, I guess, some of the Nazi sympathies early on. But all of that added up to me being pretty ooked out and like, oh, do I have to throw all my Joseph Campbell books away? I read them, I marked them up so much.
Today on Reading Dungeons and Dragons Aloud, Ben and Scott will defend Patricia Pulling and take apart John Campbell.
Joseph.
Joseph, I'm sorry.
All right,
John,
should we
John
get?
Campbell was my friend's brother who was a wrestling state champion in 1989. So
All right. Let How about I read some more from the DMG?
let's do that.
All right, that was a fruitful first paragraph, though. While the intelligence of the player character will dictate how many and which spells can be and are known, the knowledge is not automatic. Each and every spell, except those which, quote, master, unquote, was generous enough to bestow upon the character, must be found somewhere and recorded in the character's spell books. Thus, if Redulit, am I saying that right? Redu,
Redolent?
Redulant? Redulant. Thus, if Redulant the Prestidigitator, Intelligence 15, has a repertoire of 7 spells and finds a scroll with yet another, there is a 65% chance that the spell can be understood by that worthy, if in
What?
fact it can be comprehended. Redulant must, I'm really tripping over that name. Redulant must then record the spell in his book, thus destroying that portion of the scroll, of course. And he is now the proud possessor of 8 first level spells, just 3 short of the maximum he'll be able to know. I have questions and comments. Do you want to go first?
I'm going to make a small comment. I think this is the first time, and that Mr. Gygax, Sir Gygax, if only we had a knighting system in the United States, he would be Sir Gygax, has ever used an example with a specific name of a character that I'm aware of.
Well, and redolent means I want to say smells like something heavily scented. Redolent with rat feces is not a place you'd want to be, right? So like that's a really a high SAT flex there
Yeah, and for
from
those scoring at home,
Gygax.
yeah, for those scoring at home, the name is spelled Redouleent. So I think anybody's pronunciation of that is, again, up to your own interpretation. What were your comments on this?
So, first of all, I think this is actually a really good description of the finding a spell process. Something that typically when I'm playing or running D&D, I just skip over because it just seems like we want to get to the play and you have so few spells to begin with. Let's just get it over with and take them. Um, but having read an awful lot of D&D material where it's like, and there's a spell scroll with these spells attached, blah 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 blah. Uh, reading, why that's important to the game and kind of reading that description for the first time is interesting to me. Also, I think it's a pretty good description of that process. Like, you can learn this many spells. You have a spell book that has this many spells. You got some from Master, but now you need to go find your own. How are you going to find these spells? Um, Making the spells a limited resource is interesting. Like, even though, like I said, I've always just glossed over it. The thing that confuses me is uh, our prestidigitator here has an intelligence of 15 and has a 65% chance that the spell can be understood by him. And I'm like, where did that 65% come from? Is that like innate with intelligence? Do I need to go look in the player's handbook?
I think it's there is a table of like what you have to roll on, whether you can successfully transcribe a book into your spell book, and my guess is that's got to be the percentage from somewhere else in the book
Really?
in the rules.
Huh. Because that to me seems like maybe a bridge too far. So the cleric just needs to keep the gods happy and he prays and he gets his spells. The wizard has to go through all this mishigas, it sounds like.
Yeah,
Um,
no, I mean, I specifically remember, when you would find if you would find a scroll, and again, how many first edition adventures were always based on this concept of like, I remember entire adventures would be based on the concept of like, we have heard that there was a wizard in an old tower that had a spell book, And the wizard in the group would be like, oh, we have to go there because this was the way that you got spells back in the day. I one of the issues that I have with modern Dungeons and Dragons, and it's funny because I'm running Strahd later today, and thankfully my group can't hear this on the same day as they're probably going to go to fifth level today. And I always find it so strange, this concept of like they haven't done anything like the I suppose you can kind of somewhat abstract the concept that the fighter has suddenly six more hit points to get because I guess he's learned a little bit around the rigors of Mortal Kombat so much that he's harder to hit. But this concept that suddenly a wizard knows three more spells is bizarre. There's no in-game reason for that. What there was in, first edition D&D, of course, you had to train for several weeks, and the amount of weeks was based on what level, and the amount of gold that you had to pay a trainer was based on the level that you were going up. There was, it was rough.
So
I'm going. I know I'm not talking specifically
that's
about this,
perfect.
but
You allowed me to find something in the player's handbook.
excellent.
So in the player AD&D First Edition Player's Handbook, on page 10, you will find Intelligence Table 2.
Yeah.
One of the riveting facts on that is based on your intelligence ability score, it lists your chance to know each listed spell. And if you have a 15, you have a 65% chance to know a listed spell. And chance to know listed spell is explained by Uncle Gary this way, quote, chance to know each listed spell pertains to the percentage chance the character has by reason of his or her intelligence to learn any given spell in the level group. Oh, yikes, Gary. That's a sentence. Um, in other words, you read a spell, but you reading it isn't good enough. There's a roll, and if you fail the roll, you can never learn the spell. Let me keep reading. The
But
character, but
no, I'm one. Go on, go on.
the character may select spells desired in any order he or she wishes. Each spell may be checked. Each spell may be checked only once.
Yeah.
Percentile dice are rolled, and if the number generated is equal to or less than the percentage chance shown, then the character can learn and thus know that spell. It may be in his or her spell books, explained hereafter. And then we get an example, which we just heard an example, so I'm not going to read it. Wow, that's brutal.
I think they
Like,
changed that for second edition. I feel like in second edition you could try again. But I do remember when I was running. It's funny. I'm having a flashback now to when we were first running. When I was running the Slave Lords campaign with my group, my spellcaster was like, "Okay, I can never learn light." And you're like, "Yeah, deal."
wow. Like, man, I'm putting that high number into wisdom, and we are going to be a cleric. Like, we're just going to pray to
Yeah.
God every day. We're going to be really loyal to Saint Cuthbert. Because man, this is a lot of nonsense for magic users. All right, I'm going to keep reading here because I'm finding this actually fascinating. Returning to the recently completed apprenticeship. Now let us now consider the spells given to Redolent by his wise old master. Obviously, an apprentice must know how to read magic to be of use to his master. It is also an absolute must to anyone following the profession of magic user, so that spell is automatically on each magic user character's list of known spells. Then select by random means one spell each from the offensive, defensive, and miscellaneous categories listed below. I'm just going to call him Redolent. Redolent or any other player character magic user will then have a total of four, count them, four spells with which to seek his or her fortune. Yeah, again, like it's funny, like four, count them four. Like he's really giving you some voice here. Um, and did that make sense to you? Was that cogent?
Yeah. Did you mean sure?
Okay, let me ask. So obvious, it says obviously an apprentice must know how to read magic to be of use to his master. Isn't read magic a spell?
Yes.
And what does it read?
But I think you in AD&D you automatically get read magic at first level. It is a spell, so it comes with all the concept that you have to memorize it. You have to have it ready to go. But every magic user has it automatically, if I'm not mistaken.
Huh. And does it but when you cast read magic, what are you actually reading?
A scroll
Huh.
or yeah, or a spell book.
So you need to cast read magic in order to read the spell book to have a 65% chance if you have an intelligence of 15 of being able to know the spell and write it down in your spell book so you can use it from then on.
That sounds about right.
Oh my God. Why didn't anyone ever play a wizard?
Also, you get to cast it once per day, and then you've got to
Oh
throw darts at the bad guys.
God. This is rough. All right. So
Oh, and how many hit points did a first level wizard
1d4,
get?
right?
1d4? That's what I was gonna say. So yeah.
All right, I'm gonna read the I said I was gonna avoid tables, but I'm gonna read this one because it's fairly short and might be interesting to you. So the offensive spells, which might randomly be in your spell book, are Burning Hands, Charm Person, Enlarge, Friends, Light, Magic Missile, Push, Shocking Grasp, Sleep. If you roll a 10, you get to choose. Defensive spells, Affect Normal Fires, which is a great title. Dancing Lights, Featherfall, Hold Portal, Jump, Protection from Evil, Shield, Spider Climb, Ventriloquism, Choose. Miscellaneous spells: Comprehend Languages, Detect Magic, Erase, Find Familiar, Identify, Mending, Message, Unseen Servant, Write, and if you roll a 10, you get to choose. Last paragraph in this section: choice should be left to the player. What? Note that both Nice Duel's Magic Aura and Tensor's Floating Disk must be located by the character. They can never be known at the start. If your campaign is particularly difficult, you may wish to allow choice automatically. You can furthermore allow an extra defensive or miscellaneous spell so that the character begins with 5 spells. So, as a person for whom D&D has never been their prime TTRPG experience, I actually feel like that was some of the most important background information that I didn't know. Um, like I don't think I've ever played a wizard in any D&D game ever. Uh, but I've run stuff, and so I'll come across things like spell scrolls, and I'm like, who cares about a spell scroll? Like, why does this matter at all? Uh, and frankly, again, like second edition was my first edition. I feel like I read cover to cover, and I feel like that it didn't have that in there, or it was confusing to me, or I forgot it, or again, maybe it's just because I was too busy being a dual wielding fighter to care, and was too busy reading The Complete Warrior to care. But I feel like that was an explanation of D&D wizard lore that clarified 1,000 things for me. So well done, Gary, in that regard. But sheesh, why is he making it so hard on the wizards?
Yeah, I have very little to say. I just feel like you buried the lead, which is to me like throughout that entire paragraph, I just wanted to say, so Ben, what do you usually play?
Oh, um, what game? What role playing games?
No, no, what when if and when you pick up Dungeons and Dragons, what class is you said you've never played a wizard, so now I'm more curious as to what do you usually play? What class do you usually
I
play
think
when
I've played D&D. I think I've played D&D less than 10 times in my life. Um, I've run it, dozens of times, I'm going to say, but probably less than 50.
you?
Um, thinking, yeah, I would say less than 50 games of D&D is a good guess. Um, but I will tell you, back in seventh grade, when I had the second edition player's handbook and I was dreaming about playing second edition AD&D, um, the thing I would make again and again and again is a dual wielding fighter. You know, at first it was a long sword in one hand and a short sword in the other. And then after I got the complete fighter, which I believe finally had rules that would allow me to dual wield long swords, it would be a dual wielding long sword person who, of course, had 18 strength and 18 dexterity. So that you were, just really so good, hard to hit. Slap some leather armor on that guy and you're ready to go. And then when I got the complete Book of Elves, it was Blade Singer, Blade Singer, Blade Singer. Perhaps only because there was the most incredible illustration of a blade singer in that book. And if you don't know what a blade singer is, although I feel like I've talked about blade singers so often that everyone should know at this point what the blade singer is, but it was a uh, elven fighter mage who could like fight and cast spells at the same time. And the way they did it was just this kind of weird dance with swords. And you're like, oh, using swords and casting the spells at the same time. And again, really, this is now all adolescent power fantasy stuff, right? Um, you know, and I think I mentioned before, I was one of the smarter kids in class. I always felt like a smart, reasonably smart person. But I always felt weak. I definitely always felt like the weakest kid in class. Because I have a bone thing that I don't think I've ever talked about, but like I break bones really easily. Like I broke my pinky finger. I don't even know how many times, which is why it's shaped kind of like a destroyer. But for those of you who can see the video, I showed you my incredibly wonky finger. I've had a concussion. I broke one leg twice, more broken ribs than I can count, more broken toes than I can count. Uh, I talked about breaking my legs. I have two crushed vertebrae. Um, so, I think because of that physical weakness, I was always like, yeah, I want to be a fighter. I want to be a fighter. I want to be a fighter. Yesterday at the park, my 3-year-old followed some 12-year-olds off to climb a small rocky cliff, and I followed my 3-year-old, thinking there's no way my 3-year-old will successfully climb this rocky cliff with these 12-year-olds. Next thing I know, he's 5 feet up the cliff, and I am now climbing up the cliff too, to protect my 3-year-old, who is not only following the 12-year-olds but repeating everything they say. Finally, we get to the top, uh, and now we have to get down the cliff. And my wife has turned her face away. She's like, I don't want to see what is going to happen next. I don't want to see, is my husband gonna fall? Is my 3-year-old gonna fall? Who's gonna break some limbs here? And afterwards, she told me of the two, she was more worried about me than my son. But so did that
That was a fantastic answer. I when I was writing my dissertation, it was funny. I found myself when I was like writing folks thinking around like what does your choice of classes, especially, and I think Dungeons and Dragons is always the best example to go to because I think it's the archetype, we think about it in terms of it being the archetypal tabletop role-playing game. Why do people choose the classes that they do and what does it say about them? And you just gave the most fantastic answer. Literally, like because you just entangled it. There you go. We almost got
do a
through the
shot?
entire podcast without me saying the term concept entanglement, but there's no way that your choice of character or even the way that you're going to perform or think about your character is not going to be necessarily entangled with the player, whether it's a power fantasy or whether it's something that they want to explore in some concept. And so I always found it when I was writing my dissertation, I kept wanting to ask players, and I will give this when I was asking Mark Miller a few questions about Traveler and his some of the motivations for some of the design choices he made when Traveler. The last question I asked him, because he was talking about, Dungeons and Dragons was just such a revelatory experience for the folks that working at the Game Designers Workshop. And I had to add, I was like, okay, so out of curiosity, when you were playing Dungeons and Dragons so much, what class did you play? And for those of you who would like to know, Mark Miller always played a fighter, which I thought was interesting because that is not the class that I would pick for him. When I was a kid, I was obsessed with. I thought cleric was the coolest, and it's funny because now I would rarely. Now I love all the classes. Like if you asked me to sit down at a game at cons, whenever I sit down and I'm playing a new game, I'll pick any class and have fun with it, except for Warlock. For those of you who created Fifth Edition, oh my gosh, like warlocks are so cool on paper, and they're just nothing but what's the spell they just constantly cast over and over, arcane blast or something like that. They're not very interesting, but I digress.
So
I was obsessed with cleric when I was a kid, and then later I was obsessed with thief. But as an adult, my favorite class absolutely is bard. And again, that concept of entanglement. I just love the concept that a bard is a traveling is both a bit of a lush, but also like knows all the lore. So you can figure out how that fits it to who I am as a person.
so I think I mentioned the week of Gary Con. I played two games of, I played one and I ran one, games of old school D&D. And especially running it after having played it was a bit revelatory because I think it explains why I didn't they were both really good experiences, but I think it explains my pathology and the way old school D&D is played. I think explains why I didn't super get into D&D as a player or dungeon master. So again, I wanted to play out this power fantasy in D&D as a weak tween. I wanted to be a strong fighter. I'm min-maxing the heck out of things to make sure that like my character is safe so that I don't have the humiliating physical failures that I do in real life, which of course eliminates real risk of death from the play experience. And after, running some D&D without the threat of death, you're like, it's kind of boring. Every combat ends the same way. You win all the time. Like, where's the choice? Where is the suspense? So then I encounter Rifts, Call of Cthulhu, and Vampire the Masquerade, all of which, so Call of Cthulhu and Rifts definitely have an increased peril of death. In Call of Cthulhu, it's practically inevitable. Making the question of like, and the question in Call of Cthulhu is, how do you solve the mystery you're presented with? Which just seem much more interesting than how do we kill things in this dungeon that we know we're going to kill everything in anyway, and it's kind of boring. And Vampire the Masquerade had essentially a prohibition against violence in it, which meant that you had to solve all your problems using politics, which presented a much richer, deeper play experience for both me and players, I thought. Then again, how do we kill all the things in this dungeon when we know we're going to kill everything anyway? However, old school D&D where you have a more pressing and present threat of death is way more interesting. Uh, and I think for decades, essentially, I had been playing D&D the wrong way. Because again, if you'd asked me, I would say, well, when a character dies, their story ends, and we're telling a story here. And, I'm going to ask the character if they're okay with their character dying. And I'm like, no, that's all wrong in D&D. You can't do that. Like, it doesn't work. Um, so it is interesting to think that again, here I am 45 going on 46, and despite having written books about D&D and again, played some and run some in my life, I feel like I didn't really figure it out until recently. And again, it was the OSR that kind of showed me the way. Um, I can understand death saves in D&D 5e, but when I ran Old School Essentials a couple weeks ago, a character, failed a save and was dissolved by acid, vomited by an automaton. Um, and that really made for an exciting play moment when it's like, oh, this is all real, it all matters. Be careful, guys. Roll good on those saves, or you'll melt in acid.
Yeah,
So,
we're currently 6 days away from my character Janace, who, by the way, it's a portmanteau of Janelle Jacase names. Who unfortunately, my character Janace just passed away in
oh,
the fifth edition game that I was playing in, and she decided to run into a cave of no. Well, she was. It's well, I write this in my dissertation. I always find it hilarious that anybody who plays, and this is so true of anybody, if you ever read academic texts around Dungeons and Dragons, if it's from Daniel McKay to Growling Cover to just about anything, anytime a person, and it's funny, I was about to say, I don't know if Dr. Laycock talks about his actual game, but my guess is it must be coming at some point. Almost every academic text, at some point, the writer will always tell you a story about their game or like what happened to their game. It's so unbelievably interesting how intimate these experiences become that we have to share them. Like but anyway, my character recently passed away, and it was, it's a bit of a strange little experience to have them. And I was going to say, and we are running it was a 5e game, but we were running a very good friend of mine is running this game, and he's using a mod for fifth edition called Giphy Glyphs Darker Dungeons. And I was looking it up because I'm like, all right, who created this? But evidently the person's name is actually Giphy Glyph.
hmm.
Um, but it has a strange save mechanic that's a little harsher than 5e's version. It's very very mechanical based on whether your character is going to make it. My character was as I was just going to say, you just can't talk about Dungeons and Dragons without telling a story about what happened to your characters. But yeah, she was stabbed in the shoulder by a gnoll in a cave, and she bled out in front of everybody. And
Oh,
I'm going
brutal.
to be okay. Unfortunately, Janace is not going to be okay.
But
Um,
that's what makes D&D interesting.
right, it does. It does. Well, you've got to have some kind of, you know, I don't know. What is it about this concept of either how the characters I was gonna say live on. Isn't the correct word, but that kind of like strange resonance of like there is a moment of resonance, I suppose. When you've lost a character, you'll never forget them. I would actually say that it's more like I can remember almost all of my characters that have met awful fates in different caves and dungeons and wildernesses than I can the ones who prospered and did fine. Like that was actually weirder and more boring. I still remember playing college in my one with the village of Hamlet. I can still remember the moment where they were like, the only way for this party to survive is for me to uh, literally stand in the doorway to hold the door closed for the rest of them, knowing that my character wasn't going to make it through that as they were, taken out by the host of monsters that kind of ran them down. I find that really interesting. Also, I've been thinking a lot, and I know we've got to wrap up, so I'm going to leave on this. I've been so fascinated in the last couple weeks. I have this question that I want someone to answer. Whatever happened to Vampire the Masquerade?
Oh
Like
my
in the
God. I
night,
mean, I can talk about that, but we
yeah,
don't, we're definitely over time. So
let's
I
let's
will,
hold on to that question.
yeah,
I want to throw it out to Discord
I'm
as
just,
well.
we'll tell you, we'll get some people on the show to talk about what happened to Vampire the Masquerade.
That was the only game that everybody was talking about for like 6 years, and now you, where is it?
I will
Right?
tell you very briefly. It was purchased by an Icelandic company that was hoping to make video games, and it has kind of uh been then and since then for a long time that's why it was just went away. Now it is licensing out the TTRPG rights to I want to say Renegade, but I might be wrong. This is the fifth edition of Vampire. I own it. I haven't read it. I hear it's good, but like I haven't run it or played it, so I don't know. Uh, but we have to do outro and show notes because we are just over time.
Yeah.
So briefly, I want to point out Shannon Appelcline wrote A History of Traveler, and it is now available for pre-order from Mongoose Press. You get a PDF upon purchase, and it then physical copies, I believe, are coming in the autumn. Shannon Appelcline is, I'm going to say, the foremost TTRPG historian of our time. I would say Peterson is the foremost D&D historian, but Appelcline, if you're just going general, like he'd be a guy who could tell you for 30 to 40 minutes the entire history of Vampire the Masquerade just extemporaneously. Uh, he lives a cloistered hermit-like existence on one of the islands of Hawaii. And again, I cannot overstate my confidence in his abilities and the inevitable brilliance of this work. So go purchase it. I'll put a link in the show notes. I'm going to purchase a copy, and Scott, I think I should purchase you a copy too, using money from the Patreon.
Yeah, I always
Uh,
find it interesting. I didn't know that he lived in Hawaii, but his game store was the same one when I lived out in Alameda, California. We actually went to the same game store and I never once ever ran into him before, so that was
that's
kind of
hilarious.
interesting. But yeah, anybody who doesn't have all of the volumes of Designers and Dragons is seminal work on
Yeah.
all the different companies that basically emerged out of the tabletop role-playing game explosion in the 1970s and 1980s and then beyond. I mean, I guess they go up to the 1990s. Those books are just absolutely fantastic and
Oh yeah.
certainly
Oh yeah.
indispensable for the work that I did.
Yeah. Um, if you have not, for some reason, not yet purchased my book, Slaying the Dragon: A Secret History of Dungeons and Dragons, please go do so. Uh, I just had a huge burst of reviews on Amazon, which is very encouraging. I will also mention today is April 14th. As of today, in my local Amazon, there's only three hardcover copies left of my book, which I certainly find to be very promising, but if you want the first print run, nice fancy hardcover, might be your last time to get it. I know I have a local distributor I use for, I have some books lying around because people ask me to autograph them and send them to them, blah blah blah. Uh, my local distributor, Porchlight Books, told me that they sent me their last 10 hardcover copies. So again, if you're interested in a hardcover copy of the first print run, now is the time. Uh, Other than that, please join us on our Discord. And to join us on our Discord,
Oh,
you have to join our Patreon. Uh, $3 a month allows you to support the show. We couldn't do it without you. So please help us out. Give us $3 a month if you're enjoying this. We should be available everywhere now. If you're listening to this, you should be able to listen to this anywhere you want to, plus on YouTube. I hope that that is true. And with that, we've gone 6 minutes over, Scott. So I am just going to say goodbye, good luck. I hope everybody has a good week. I hope you have a good week, Scott. Anything else you need to say?
no. Just, just I want everyone out there to know that Janace will be very much missed, my character.
Yeah, oh, you know who what I should say
It's
at the end of every show that I have not said yet. This is episode 6, but the show could not happen with our producer Chris, who edits the audio on this and edits video on this. He is the unseen third hand of reading D&D aloud, and I should really credit him at the end of every show, and I have not done that yet, so I'm doing it here and I'm doing it now. All right, Scott, you have a great week.
Take care, everyone.
Bye bye.